Yeah, I separated.
Good to speak from.
Welcome to the Wilson Center, and I'm Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program. Thank you for coming, and my apologies for not letting you bring your drinks into the room. Usually we don't allow even food in the auditorium, but we made an exception today. But for those of you who have not had lunch, there is going to be sandwiches left in the other room. This is a very special occasion for us to have two of our public policy scholars who are currently in residence speak on a panel together or debate each other. We shall see. The topic today is the U.S. and the Middle East assessing the Bush-era balance sheet. Our two speakers are Ambassador Nicholas Burns and Rami Khouri. Nick Burns is currently, as I said, a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center and is the former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He was the United States permanent representative for 4 years to NATO, served as U.S. ambassador to Greece, and was a spokesman of the Department of State and acting assistant secretary for public affairs for Secretary of State Warren Christopher and Secretary Madeleine Albright. Additionally, Nick served for 5 years on the National Security Council staff at the White House, where he was special assistant to President Clinton and senior director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia affairs. Before that, under President H.W. Bush, Mr. Burns was director for Soviet, and which then became Russian affairs. And the reason why I said that, because I would like to emphasize that Nick Burns is a career diplomat, so he served both Republican and Democratic president. And this is also what makes him so special. He's not a political appointee, he's a career diplomat. He was awarded the State Department Superior Honor Award for Outstanding Performance 3 times, the Department James Clement Dunn Award for Excellence in 1994, and in 2000, and the Charles E. Cobb Award for Trade Development by an ambassador. He has studied in Europe and in the United States, and he was given the Public Service Award by Boston College Alumni Association and many other awards, which I'm going to skip and stop here. Our next panelist is Rami Khouri, and he's going to go first. He's also currently a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center and the first director of the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. He's also a syndicated political columnist, book author, the editor-at-large, and former executive editor of Beirut-based The Daily Star. He teaches annually at the American University of Beirut, University of Chicago, and Northeastern University. He serves as a non-resident senior fellow at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and the Dubai School of Government. And he has been a fellow and visiting scholar at Harvard University, Mount Holyoke College, Syracuse University. Of course, he has a very special affinity for Syracuse because that's where he studied. Rami got in 2006 the Pax Christi International Peace Prize. If you go on our website, you can get a longer bio of both Ambassador Burns and Rami Khouri, but I'm going to stop now and just please remind you to close your cell phones, and this is a reminder to our speakers too, if they have cell phones with them, to close it, please. Rami, you go first and then followed by Nick. You can sit there and just speak, and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much, Hele. Thank you all for coming, and it's a real thrill for me to have these 2 months here at the Woodrow Wilson Center and to discover the center itself and all that there is in Washington, the positive and the negative and the in-between. But it's a very satisfying and enriching experience to get to know how things work in Washington, and we will talk a little bit about that. I'm particularly pleased to be able to have this discussion with Nick Burns, because I think Nick exemplifies the very finest in American civility, civil service, professionalism, and even when we disagree, which is often, we do so in a manner that we learn from each other. And I think, and what I think we should try to do today is to go over the issues of the Bush administration's legacy as we see them, and I would like to offer some concrete suggestions about what we learned from this legacy and what it means for the future and how to move ahead. It's hard to assess the legacy because two reasons. Some of the issues that the Bush administration has initiated in the region by nature take a long time to show if they're going to be successful or not successful. And second of all, the Bush administration's policies and the Middle East have come together at a time when the region, in any case, was in the midst of tremendous transformation, basically following the end of the Cold War. 9/11 and other issues propelled things in faster and other directions, but the main driving force was the end of the Cold War. So it's hard to really assess in any depth, but I think we can take a look at where we are now and try to see trends that we have experienced, certainly in the last, say, 5 or 6 years, and possibly some of those will continue, some of them won't. I would say generally the legacy of the Bush administration in the Middle East, as we see it today, has been generally negative and has laid the groundwork for some potentially tumultuous and maybe even catastrophic changes in the future, potentially, not necessarily so. But most of what has happened in the Middle East in relation to and as a consequence of Bush administration policies in the last 7, 8 years has made the region more unstable, more violent, more problematic for its people, first of all, and possibly for others around the world. The major flaws that I would identify, I think there's 6 issues that I would point out as sort of broad reasons for the negative American policy, or the negative consequences of American policies. I think there was a massive structural misdiagnosis of 9/11 and all that it meant. There was a massive chronic structural misdiagnosis of who these people were, where they came from, what they represented, what was the relationship of Al-Qaeda terrorism to the rest of the region, and what was this issue all about, what was the real threat of Al-Qaeda and groups like it. So that was one major structural reasons why the policies, I think, have been wrong. Second, I think because of this misdiagnosis, there has been a significant overreaction in the form primarily of the global war on terror, the GWAT, as it's called, a very severe, I think, overreaction that has stressed the war on terror at the expense of other much more important underlying issues. And I think the administration reacted to terrorism, mistaking it for a cause of the problems, while it was in fact a symptom much more. I think a third major problem has been the combination of significant and enduring indifference to the Arab-Israeli conflict until 9 months ago, and combined with a major tilt towards the pro-Israeli position rather than trying to take an even-handed position and to play the role of a credible and effective mediator. And the impact of the continuation and the aggravation of the Arab-Israeli conflict, especially the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, has had significant impact on other things in the region and has had a continuing destabilizing and radicalizing effect on the entire region. A fourth major problem, I think, that underpins the Bush administration's Middle East policy has been a combination of confusion and incoherence related to addressing the phenomenon of Islamism, political Islamism, all over the region, and especially with the pronouncements of the senior-most leaders like Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld before and others, and Condoleezza Rice and others. There's been a general conflation, at least as we see it in the region, a conflation of very different kinds of Islamist movements and terrorist movements, nationalist movements, other movements, and peaceful movements, social movements. And Washington, our perception has been that Washington has completely confused these, and by putting them all together under the umbrella of Islamic extremism, which is now perpetuated by the neo-confusion of John McCain and others like him, the idea that Islamic extremism is the greatest threat of our generation is not only factually incorrect, it's counterproductive to American interests and policies in the Middle East. But I think this has been a mainstay. And this is partly due to the overreaction of the United States as a society, not just as a government, an overreaction to the religious element, to the phenomenon of not just Islamism, but the phenomenon of Islam, and the phenomenon of religion in public life. The United States is not good at dealing with religious political dimensions, and it was burned by the Iranian Revolution. It was burned by the hostage-taking in Iran. It was attacked criminally in 9/11, and there has been a series of traumatic American encounters with movements that speak in the name of Islam or Islamism, and the United States has reacted to each one of these, I think, in a mistaken and counterproductive way. The fifth problem, I think, has been allowing this bizarre collection of neoconservative interests in Washington to drive policy in many different ways. And while it is understandable that the trauma of 9/11 triggered an American need for revenge and decisive action, the tendency to let the neoconservative elements in the administration define and drive this policy, I think, has been a catastrophe. And this has impacted on many different dimensions of American policy in the Middle East, but also on the wider negative perception of the United States around the world. And number 6 in overall issues, I would say, is the fact that broadly speaking, the Bush administration in the Middle East has badly confused and been unable to disaggregate the very different elements of nationalism, religion, resistance to occupation, and governance. 4 very different elements, nationalism, religion, resistance, and governance, have been, I think, usually badly conflated together in the eyes of many people in Washington. And this has caused, I think, a policy in Washington to be driven by a severe and, I think, continuing and almost blindness to the 3 big issues that matter to the people of the Middle East, or certainly of the Arab Islamic region of the Middle East. And those 3 issues are identity, sovereignty, and legitimacy. And I think in almost total, we perceive the Bush administration's policies. They may mean it differently, but we see it as being almost totally blind to the imperatives of identity, sovereignty, and legitimacy. So those 6 big general issues, I think, explain a lot of the reasons why I think the Bush policy has been counterproductive and rather destructive. I think most of the policy goals that the Bush administration set in the region have not been met, as far as I can tell, except for 3 that I can see. That there has not been an attack on American soil since 9/11. There have been attacks against American interests abroad, but not on American soil. The Ba'athist regime has been thrown out of Iraq with a lot of negative consequences, but that regime is no longer there. And the third thing is the establishment of the International Tribunal to try the murders of Hariri and others in Lebanon. I cannot see any other major significant achievements in the Middle East in terms of U.S. policy. And if you look around the region very quickly, give me a 2-minute warning.
Have plenty.
Okay.
You can go another 5. No, you have 5 minutes.
Okay.
More,
if you look quickly around the region, again from an Arab perspective from within the region, I think in every major situation that we see where the United States has been involved in a clear policy orientation and has often explicitly stated a policy goal, in almost every case it has not been able to achieve that policy, and in some cases has achieved exactly the reverse of what it wanted. So if you look in Palestine, for instance, the feud between Fatah and Hamas, the United States came down very strong on the side of the Fatah Mahmoud Abbas administration with money and arms and all kinds of reports of covert funding. Who knows if they're accurate or not? But explicitly, openly, the U.S. was with Fatah to try to knock down Hamas, and that has completely failed. In Lebanon, a similar situation happened. The U.S. government strongly came to the support of the Senora government, the March 14 forces, trying to knock down Hezbollah and its allies, and was not able to achieve that. You now have a much stronger Hezbollah and its allies' presence in the Lebanese government. The confrontation with Iran does not seem to have gone very well. The centrifuges are spinning faster and faster, and there's more and more of them. And the Western countries are continuing to talk to Iran and make gestures, but there may be finally some good news where the Iranians and the Western countries are perhaps now in a position where they're ready perhaps to start making a deal. But the general American tendency to try to stop Iran from getting the full nuclear fuel cycle capability seems not to have worked, and Iranian influence in the region has become much, much stronger in many different aspects, not just with Shiite groups, but also with Sunni groups and other nationalist groups around the region. The Iraq situation is very problematic. It's going to take a long time to find out how that's going to settle, but in the short run, the consequences of Iraq on the region in terms of wasted money, in terms of violence, of blowback from terrorism training, the refugee flows, the radicalizing effects on people all over the region, the criticism of the U.S. all over the region, the shock waves from Iraq are still rather negative, and we'll have to see how that settles. It's still in progress. The oil and energy situation in the region and globally is not a very happy one. Oil prices are down to about $125 now, but it's a very difficult situation. It's not all due to American policy, obviously. There's many other reasons, demand and other issues. But the American militaristic approach in the Middle East has created fears in the minds of oil traders and others, and we see the impact on the rising price of energy and the heightened vulnerability if anything should happen in Iran or other places. We saw in Iraq how attacking oil pipelines was a major activity. Syria, the U.S. has tried to pressure Syria, hasn't done very well. The Syrians have stood their ground. The Syrians feel that they're pretty confident now, and they're now being reintegrated into Europe and other places. Fighting the Islamist wave around the Middle East has been a major American policy goal. Hasn't worked very well. The Islamists have become stronger in most places, and you're starting to get linkages now with all kinds of different groups, Iranians, Arabs, Syrian, secular, Ba'athists, religious Islamist fundamentalists, all kinds of different groups that used to fight one another are now working together, mainly brought together by their desire to confront the United States and Israel and some Arab regimes. So you have a whole new constellation of forces that have come about in the Middle East, defying, resisting, standing up to, and sometimes physically or politically fighting the United States. And the reaction to the U.S. has been a major driving force to bring these forces together, and the Islamist wave is only part of this process. The issue of terrorism The United States clearly has been focusing on terror issues. The terror problem has gotten probably worse and more difficult to fight. The terror groups are diffused, decentralized. Many of them are local copycat groups in Europe and Asia and the Middle East, all over the place. And it's a much more difficult challenge now than it was 7 or 8 years ago, and combined with the terrorism is the fact that political violence, explosions, attacks, suicide attacks, armed invasions, resistance, political violence that used to be episodic and occasional has now become a chronic and everyday fact of life throughout the Middle East, practiced by the governments of the region. All of them, Arabs, Israelis, Turks, Iranians, all the governments use violence routinely, opposition groups and terror groups, and foreign armies, especially the American and the British. And so we have a chronic, regional-wide cycle of violence, which is now a norm, and partly this is driven by the American use of arms and the reaction to it. And finally, democracy promotion has not worked very well. Native Democrats in the Arab world and other parts of the Middle East are silent. They have been completely marginalized. And the double standards that the U.S. and Europe and Israel and others showed to the Hamas election has been a death blow to the credibility of democracy promotion from Washington, certainly, and also from Europe. So democracy has not been promoted in any significant way, and the autocratic tendency in many parts of the Middle East has been strengthened, partly because of the impact of the global war on terror. So that's a pretty grim overview and there's other issues. We can talk about Somalia, Yemen, Algeria, Sudan, Tunis. There's many other places we can talk about, but this is, I think, a quick overview. I think when you take specific case by case, the U.S. has not done well, and in many cases had brought about exactly the opposite consequence of what it wanted. So, broadly speaking, what are the consequences? The U.S. allies in the region, the so-called moderates, are mostly more vulnerable, and in some cases you find they have shrinking control over their own territory. Moderate governments are often unable to expand their brief to their entire territories because of their lack of capacity and lack of credibility. U.S. influence is weaker in the region. The U.S. is in a bizarre situation where it is using more force, more threats, more sanctions, more diplomatic pressure all over the region with less and less impact. More and more people in the region are completely unafraid of the United States. The United States generates now, broadly speaking, neither respect nor fear, and that's not a very good place to be if you're a big power trying to influence things in the Middle East. And if you people don't respect you and they don't fear you, then you've just indulged in a massive process of self-marginalization. And I think this is a real problem for the United States, because deep down people don't respect or fear the U.S. politically or militarily, but they respect it and embrace it in terms of its values, its people, and what it stands for. They want to be friends with the U.S., but the government policies of the U.S. have led to the situation where the U.S. has neither impact nor does it generate respect or fear. Iran and its allies are stronger. Arab Democrats are dormant. Terrorism is increasing. Violence is everywhere, I mentioned. And you have this broad situation where you have the Middle East broadly configured in two loose coalitions of forces, one with the U.S., one with Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others like that. And there's a major new regional confrontation in the region that has to be solved. So what to do? I'll finish by just making a few quick points. What should the U.S. do, and what? I mean, I've just pointed out the negative things. There aren't many positive things to point out, in my view, in terms of U.S. policy, other than the fact that the vast majority of people in the Arab Islamic Middle East still respect the United States values, people, traditions, systems. They want to be friends with the U.S. They want the U.S. to be engaged politically, but in a more even-handed way. So there's a tremendous foundation of goodwill that can be activated. And on that basis, I would say what the U.S. should do and what the next administration should explore is first of all to engage legitimate actors, engage all legitimate actors in the region. And legitimacy, I think, needs to be defined by two things. Legitimacy is defined by local validity of the actors themselves. If somebody in some country is locally elected and clearly represents a large number of those people, they have legitimacy. The second aspect of legitimacy is respect for international norms and standards, so that if you don't do terrorism, you don't do violence, you don't do genocide, you respect international norms, you should be engaged. And if there are actors who do both, like, for instance, the Irish Republican Army, let's take an example, the United States engaged them in a political process that heightened their local legitimacy and reduced their disrespect for international norms and terror. And that's exactly what the United States should do in the region. Embrace the legitimate local actors, and if they do terrorism or other things, then deal with them in a manner. And that includes embracing the Israeli government according to exactly the same standards. If Israel goes against international norms and human rights and UN resolutions, the U.S. should do exactly the same thing with Israel as it does with Hezbollah and Hamas and others. Second thing is seek peace, security, and prosperity for all the people of the region at a same level, and not be selective in where it pushes for democracy or peacemaking or elections. The third thing is to be consistent, which is part of this process. The lack of consistency and the perception of U.S. double standards is the major, most pervasive complaint that people have against the U.S. is the lack of consistency. Number 4, use multilateralism more. The United States cannot just come to the region and suddenly decide that we've got to get the neighbors involved to solve Iraq, when the United States has done nothing and ignored all the neighbors who've been telling the U.S. for the last 40 years, do something about the Arab-Israeli conflict. You can't just selectively be multilateral. You need to do it as a basic value. Number 5 is, I think the U.S. should appeal to the majority of people, the majority of moderate, normal, decent citizens in the Arab Islamic Middle East, and not let itself be in the ridiculous situation of predominantly responding to this small cult-like terrorist group, Qaeda, and others like it. The United States has allowed its foreign policy to be driven heavily by this small minority of violent people, rather than responding and engaging that large majority of people in the region who want to deal with it and share its values. Number 6, the U.S. needs to define its national interests according to American national interests. It cannot let pro-Israeli groups, pro-arms groups, pro-oil groups, pro-conservative Arab monarchy groups, it cannot let these special interest frenzied lobbies drive and define the national interest. If the United States is unable to engage in an open, honest public debate about the influence of various lobby groups in Washington, then it should get out of the business of trying to spread democracy if it cannot itself act in a democratic way according to its own national interest. And number 7, the U.S., I think, should engage with others, but take the lead in an active, even-handed peacemaking process in the Arab-Israeli conflict. This remains the single biggest radicalizing force, destabilizing force in the region. There are other problems in the region, of course, but resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I think is resolvable, resolving it is the single biggest contribution the U.S. could make to then diffusing some of these other tensions and making some of these other things easier. Imagine if the U.S. had taken a decisive peacemaking, a decisive and even-handed peacemaking approach in the Arab-Israeli conflict as it did in Northern Ireland, say in 1975, before Hamas and Hezbollah even existed. They would never have existed when the Shah was still in power in Iran. When the impact of the continuation of Arab-Israeli conflict and the American tilt to Israel and all these other factors is with us today, and we need to learn those lessons. So those 7 points I think I offer as constructive suggestions, and they offer us a lot of scope for discussion, and hopefully with the new administration. Thank you.
I do. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I first want to thank the Wilson Center for agreeing to have me join its ranks this summer. I've been here for 2 months. It's been a great experience. This is a unique place. It's under excellent management and in the persons of Lee Hamilton and Mike Van Duzen. I think we're very lucky to have Hala here as director of the Middle East program, and I felt very welcome here. And it's been fun to get to know Rami a little bit better. As you can imagine, we don't always agree. In fact, we rarely agree on our respective analyses of the Middle East, but he certainly is. He certainly is a real authority and someone who's distinguished himself through his scholarship and writing. I can't speak to his affiliation of sports teams here in the United States because we're on opposite sides of the barricade there as well. But in any case, it's a pleasure to share the podium with him. I wanted to just give you, I wanted to actually just inject a disclaimer. For those of you who may have just been on summer vacation for the last few months, I have left the State Department and I have retired. And I say that because a very close friend of mine, also named Burns, Bill Burns, has taken, is now in the position that I held until March, and he is not responsible, nor is the U.S. government, for anything I'm about to say. So you're about to hear the musings and ramblings of a private citizen. I just thought, since there had been some confusion in the press about the two Burnses, I wanted to set the record straight. I wanted to step back a little bit and actually not look, I want to look ahead by giving perhaps a little bit of context for how Americans, at least Americans who have served in our government over the last, say, 2 or 3 administrations, look at the modern Middle East and look at our interests there. And the first thing I'd say is this. I think our global policy now is centered more on the Middle East than it ever has been before. And I certainly feel safe in saying that the Middle East is by far the most vitally important region to the United States. That may seem obvious to all of us living in 2008, having just gone through these tremendous series of crises over the last 7 or 8 years. But if you look back about 100 years, and specifically look back to Woodrow Wilson's presidency, American policy in the world was centered more on Europe until about 10 or 15 years ago than any other part of the world. In fact, from Woodrow Wilson's intervention in the First World War, when he sent 1 million American troops in April 1917 to the Western Front, all the way through to Bill Clinton's correct intervention in Kosovo between March and June of 1999, our foreign policy from this capital was more centered on Europe than any other place because that's where the vital challenges were. When we confronted the rise of fascism during the 20s and 30s, when we prosecuted successfully the Second World War, the 5 decades of the Cold War, and the 2 interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo in the 90s and the Balkans, it was all about Europe. But I think since the turn of the millennium, and certainly in the presidency of George W. Bush, and I do think there's a national consensus on this of people involved in foreign policy, we understand that the crises have shifted and that part of the world that is most problematic for the United States and that contains the greatest future threats, some of them mortal, is now the Middle East. And I would say the second part of the world where that is also true is South Asia. Now that's surprising for a lot of people. 10 years ago, very few people would have said that we have vital interests concerning the basic safety and security of the American people in South Asia, but it's undoubtedly true, given the commitment we have in Afghanistan, given the fact that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are there, and given the problems along the Pakistan-Afghan border itself. So this part of the world, from the Middle East to South Asia, is now the most important part of the world for American policymakers. That has been true for the Bush administration. It will undoubtedly be true for either President Barack Obama or President John McCain, whomever is elected by the American people. If you look at the agenda we have in the Middle East, it's quite daunting. The Bush administration has had that the next president will have. We have a major American national commitment in Iraq, which very few people believe we can just wish away. We did enter that country in 2003. We are responsible partly for what happens there, along with the Iraqi authorities, obviously. We have 130,000 plus American troops there. And debating in this country after November, after our elections, how to be successful there. How to use the influence that we have to help secure stability and help produce an environment where the Iraqis can succeed themselves and find a measure of peace and security that they've not had for many years is a major American national priority. Second is the problem of Iran. An Iran that is seeking a nuclear weapons capability, most people would say. An Iran that is a major actor in Iraq and has been a major funder and supplier of arms to the Shia militant groups that have been attacking American forces and Iraqi forces with some regularity over the last several years. And of course, an Iran that in the wider region that Rami talked about has been an agent of instability. Iran funding and arming Hezbollah and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Shia militants in Iraq and the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's quite a record. So every place where the United Nations, the Arab world, the European Union, Japan, Australia, the United States, the countries involved, are trying to work towards peace and stability and to diminish violence, Iran is stoking those fires. And so the challenge posed by Iran is quite considerable to the United States. And as I watch our own campaign and look at the positions of the two candidates, I think both of them agree this will be a major American national priority to devise a strategy towards Iran that can be effective in containing Iran and in preventing Iran from becoming a further disturbance to the general situation in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the United States, of course, has a basic interest in supporting the democratically elected government against the attempt by Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah to unseat it or diminish its authority. In the situation concerning Israel and the Palestinians, there I would say that the United States, Secretary Rice specifically, has done the right thing in initiating the Annapolis process, in making that a major priority of the administration. The number of trips that she's made to the region, the level of commitment that she's clearly conveyed, the sense that the United States is willing to be that mediator that Rami talked about. I think we've risen to that challenge. And I would hope on that situation that 60 years after the creation of the State of Israel, where the Israelis have known not a single day of peace in their 60 years of existence as a state, the United States will remain focused on being a good friend and partner to Israel, and to essence help the Israelis negotiate a very difficult situation. On the other hand, I know, as do many of you by personal experience who are Palestinian, that May 14th, 1948 has a very different connotation and a very different meaning. It's the date when the Palestinians were dispersed, and they have just been dispersed throughout the Middle East and throughout the world ever since. And a lack of justice and a lack of a state for the Palestinians is a major problem for the people of the Middle East, but also for the United States. And I do think that Secretary Rice deserves credit for having recognized two things: that our fundamental obligation is to help protect the security needs of the Israeli people and the Israeli state, but it is also to help create a Palestinian state and to achieve some measure of justice for the Palestinians who have received very little over the last 60 years. Now, I'm not smart enough to know, and I'm no longer with the government, what the chances are for some limited or even complete success of that process between now and January 20th of 2009. But I do know this: whatever happens in that process in the coming months, it's going to be very important that the baton can be handed off from Secretary Rice to the new President and Secretary of State, so that America doesn't lose ground, so that the next American administration doesn't have to start at point zero, and that we can continue to be an active, engaged, and effective mediator between the Israelis and Palestinians. Because I do agree with Rami that the absence of that peace pervades the entire region and is a negative force in the entire region for both Israel as well as the Palestinians. But I do think that Secretary Rice deserves some praise, and I was compiling my mental list of American achievements in the Middle East. Rami, when you said we basically had none, I would start there. I think she has committed the United States to be in the center of this conflict in a diplomatic way, in the way that Henry Kissinger did, in the way that Jimmy Carter did, in a way that Bill Clinton did. And I think that continues the American tradition. It is not our sole responsibility to produce that peace. The Palestinians now quite divided. The Israelis have a lot to do with that and bear the primary responsibility. And I think it's correct for this discussion to place responsibility where it lies most. On Iran, I'd say this: we Americans need to think very clearly and in a very serious and tough way about the challenge posed to Iran. We can't wish it away. This is not a government in Tehran that is acting, we believe, certainly I believe, in the best interest of its own people. It is striking to look consistently at the public opinion polls in Iran, the disaffection of the people of Iran from their own government, the generally positive attitude that most Iranians have for our country is belied by the actions of the Iranian government. And for a country like ours that sees that we have vital interests in the Middle East, we cannot disregard a government, and I won't say a people because I don't believe that government always acts on behalf of the attitudes and beliefs of its own people. It is such a troublemaker, a government that injects itself in a violent way to ignite terrorism and to encourage violence, as it has against the moderate Palestinians, against the democratically elected government of Lebanon, against the government of Afghanistan and the government of Iraq. That's the real objective track record of the Iranian government in its regional policy. I don't think that that can be wished away. And so the next American president, as President Bush, will have to have a very tough-minded attitude towards a government like Iran that seems intent on destabilizing very important parts of that region against, I think, the interests and wishes of the people of most of those countries. Secondly, on the nuclear question, there I think there's very little doubt that the Iranians are trying to achieve a nuclear weapons capability. They have not so far succeeded. I would say on that, again, there has been a great shift in American policy. It occurred in the winter of 2005, in the first year of President Bush's second term, when we, for the first time, swung our support, political and diplomatic, to support the Europeans who were then negotiating with the Khatami government. Since then, we've become part of this diplomatic process, the so-called P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council with Germany, trying to convince the Iranians to negotiate. We offered, we thought, the 5 of us, including the Russians and Chinese, a historic proposal on June 1st, 2006. The kind of proposal that the United States, going all the way back to the Iranian Revolution and the taking of the hostages, had not issued in the past. We fully expected the Iranians to accept that offer. They did not. That proposal was reissued by the Perm 5 in September of 2006, in June of 2007, in September of 2007, and now you've seen, 2007, yes, and now you've seen the same group, the P5 countries in Germany, reissue a variation of that proposal, and a meeting held in Geneva 2 weeks ago where that proposal was put forward. I think that it is right that we ask the Iranians to consider that proposal. These are not 5 countries without weight in the world. We're talking about Russia, China, the United States, Britain, and France, all members of the Security Council. Germany, a country that has had until recently a fair number of contacts with the Iranians, economic and political. And I think our right goal is to seek to deny a nuclear weapons capability to the Iranians. That's the goal of the P5, is to deny it through diplomacy. And again here, I think that Secretary Rice deserves credit, Rami. She took a policy where in the first term of the administration, the United States was not involved. The United States was not helping in any way to support these talks. And we swung our support behind the Europeans. And then when those talks failed because Ahmadinejad ended them in August, September of 2005, we brought the Russians and Chinese in. We widened the circle and then put a very good proposal on the table. And I think we're right to ask the Iranians to look at that proposal again and give a positive answer. And I think in that respect, the ball is in Iran's court. The whole world is waiting to hear what it will do. I hope the answer will be that the Iranians will be willing to negotiate, because that is the proper place for this policy to succeed. Now, in saying that, I would say looking forward towards the last several months of 2008 and the beginning of a new American administration, we in essence need to strengthen the diplomacy, but we also need to strengthen the sanctions. If the world truly wants to avoid a military conflict, and we should all want that, the sanctions need to be stronger. The United States and I think the European countries have put their emphasis on the sanctions and have done everything we can to put economic pressure on the Iranians. I cannot say the same for all of Iran's trading partners. China, which is now the leading trade partner of Iran. Russia, which continues to sell arms to Iran. South Korea and Japan, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, countries that have a large economic relationship with Iran but haven't done as much as Britain, France, the United States, and Germany have done. And for diplomacy to succeed, it can't all be words. You often need to offer to negotiate, as the P5 has, but also say if you can't negotiate, there's going to be a penalty. And the penalty will be further Chapter 7 UN sanctions. If the Russians and Chinese and some of the other trade partners would get behind those sanctions and push them more vigorously, then perhaps the Iranians would listen more attentively, than they have to the P5. So those are some thoughts on the nuclear issue, but I wanted to say two final things. This is a time for diplomacy vis-a-vis Iran. It's a time for diplomacy. There is room for it. There is diplomatic and geopolitical space for it. And there's time along that continuum that all of us have been monitoring. A military conflict, in my judgment right now, is neither inevitable, and it is certainly not desirable. And I do think that the United States and the other countries need to exhaust diplomacy and be very creative in trying to find our way forward to the negotiating table with Iran. It is a time for diplomacy, and I certainly think that the next American administration deserves a chance at diplomacy. I hope that's going to be the future as we watch the progress of these talks over the next several months. It's also a time, and this will be my final point, it's a time for a little bit of a thaw in America's relations with Iran, and by that I mean non-governmental. We've just been talking about the actions and attitudes of governments until now. What's particularly important about the America-Iran relationship, and Hala knows this better than anybody, having watched it and lived it for the last nearly 30 years, is how burdened we are by the history of the 1950s and 60s and 70s and 80s. And I know when I talk to Iranians, they always bring up 1953. And when they do, as a good and loyal and patriotic American, I bring up 1979 and 80 and the taking of our hostages. And we can continue as Americans and Iranians just to debate the history and to look backwards and be consumed by it and to feel the weight of the history overcome any attempt to build bridges. But apart from what the governments are able to do, and I don't know how successful the governments will or will not be able to be in coming together in negotiations, that remains to be seen. The citizens of the two countries can break down some of those barriers. Congress has been very generous over the last several years in providing the Bush administration some funds to try to bring groups of Iranians here just to visit. Healthcare professionals, disaster relief experts. The United States national wrestling team went to Iran, was received with great civility, and in a way that brought some public recognition. We need to do this. And we need to convince ourselves that the better way forward is to look forward. And is to maybe let the academics debate the past, but have the citizens begin to break down the barriers, because it's an extraordinary situation. Think of it. Our relationship with Iran is like no other of any country in the world. We've had no diplomatic relations to speak of since November 4th of 1979, to speak of. We have no business people there. We have very few American journalists able to travel there. There is a lack of contact that doesn't exist with any other country in the world. We have a liaison office in Havana. We still have an American embassy in Zimbabwe. We have an American embassy in Burma. And we're able to talk now to the North Koreans. So if the governments will have to decide whether or not they can talk. In the meantime, the people need to talk. And therefore, I support very much the Track 2 initiatives, and some people in the room have been champions of the Track 2 initiatives. But even people to people, even bringing Iranian scholars and students and young people here, I think will hopefully create a dynamic over time where a degree of normalcy begins to return to a relationship that has been badly scarred by the history of the last 30 years. And that would be my final thought, which is a private one, about what private Americans can do as we look at this very vexing problem. I'm tempted to debate everything Rami said, but I probably shouldn't, because you'd all be bored by that, and you're probably wanting to ask some questions. But let me just say, since Rami had quite an indictment against the United States policy in the Middle East, and since I was responsible for some of that, and served loyally in the administration and was proud to, I would say, Rami, that I think it would be only fair to recognize that the United States has been a good friend to the Lebanese government, particularly since the end of the war in August 2006, time after time, trying to support the democratically elected government of Lebanon against outside forces in your own region, namely Syria and Iran. Secondly, I think we deserve credit for the shift between the first term and the second term on Iranian policy itself and the clear emphasis on diplomacy that Secretary Rice has been very consistent in putting forward. Third, I know we've strengthened America's ties and understanding with some of the key moderate states of the Gulf, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain and Oman, just to name a few. Next, I would say that you have to give us credit for Annapolis, for having had the Syrians and the Israelis and the Palestinians in the same room together that day at Annapolis last November, and for Secretary Rice's persistence in sticking to it ever since. And finally, and this will be really provocative, and I expect, I'm sure, some comment on this, everybody recognizes that our involvement in Iraq since March of 2003 has been highly problematic. That country has experienced a degree of violence that no other country should wish to experience. The surge has been effective. The violence has diminished somewhat. It's still too high. But there is more reason to think now, if you're looking forward, about how we can be successful, all of us, Arabs as well as Americans, Europeans, in Iraq in the future. There is more reason to think that we are better able now to identify a way for Iraq to move forward. That's a real practical challenge that the next American president will have, and I wanted to put it in the proper context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to open now the floor to questions. Please, could I ask you to identify yourself and short questions, and if there are people in the overflow room, I'll take their questions in writing. Yes, please, and just wait for the mic. There's a mic here, Justin, the lady here, and then yeah, first here and then.
First, raise your hand.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Laura Haig. I'm a recent graduate of International Affairs. And a question I had for you when you're talking about the commitment of Secretary Rice. One question I had to help me understand if there's a commitment, why do we only say when Israel's building additional settlements in the West Bank that we say it's not helpful to the process, when I would think that if we've been working on this for a while, it's not only helpful, it seems to kind of stop the peace process. So to shed a little light on that. Thank you.
Is that to Rami or to me?
Both of you, yes, please go ahead. And Rami, if you you want to answer, sure.
Well, since I know Secretary Rice well and admire her very much, I don't doubt at all her personal commitment or the commitment that she has brought on behalf of our country to the process. It's a difficult one. I know that she has articulated very clearly our opposition to further settlement growth. And I know that the United States has also spoken out against the illegal structures and the roadblocks. I was in Israel and the Palestinian territories, I think, 3 or 4 times in the last 15 months. And my most recent visit was in January. And I was quite surprised to find out the number of roadblocks. I think at that time about 525 on the West Bank alone. There is a big issue concerning the ability of average Palestinians just to cope with daily life. If you live in Ramallah and you have to go to Jerusalem, there's no telling when you start out in the morning how long it's going to take to get there, whether you will get there, considering the amount of roadblocks that are put up to peaceful people trying to live peaceful lives. And so certainly one of the big issues as we move forward is, can the people of the West Bank, the Palestinian people, believe that this process can deliver results to them which will be meaningful? And I completely trust in the sincerity of our Secretary of State in wanting to engineer a process and drive one forward that will end up in the establishment of a Palestinian state. And in the degree of self-rule the Palestinians haven't had for 60 years. So that's the goal. And I don't doubt her degree of seriousness or purpose at all.
Yes, I'm taking down everybody's.
Hi, Paul Richter with LA Times. Question for Ambassador Burns. I was struck to hear you say that the U.S. under Secretary Rice has taken on the role of mediator. I wonder if it wouldn't be more accurate to say that the U.S. is convener or a coordinator, because I don't think that she's doing what Bill Clinton tried to do at the end of his term, where he was actually laying out proposals and trying to get the two sides to agree to them. I think she's bringing them together in a room to try to get them to find a way to a solution.
Well, we can, Paul, we can argue about the words or just discuss them. I think what's perhaps different is that, especially in the Palestinian community, there's a feeling, and I think this exists in the Israeli side too, that they can talk to each other. That wasn't always the case in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations going back 35 years. But I do know that the presence of the United States in that dynamic is critical. And whether you want to agree it's a mediating presence or it's a convening presence or a coordinating presence, maybe all three words are accurate depending on the day you take the snapshot. The Israelis and Palestinians want us to be involved. I think you've heard Rami say that most of the other people of the Middle East agree with that. I would probably say the Iranians wouldn't. I don't know about the Syrians, but most everybody else in the Middle East wants us to be involved. And the meaning of Annapolis was the reintroduction of the United States into that process. And so I think that that was the correct decision that she and the President made. And I wish them all the best, because this is extraordinarily difficult, and we should all wish them to make as much progress as possible. But I guess the difference I'm just trying to think about your very good question is there's a degree of ownership which is very positive on the part of the Palestinians and Israelis that maybe wasn't there 25 years ago. And so in that case, we don't always have to be in the room. They often meet without us, and that's a very positive sign for two peoples that need to learn not just to coexist, but actually to live and work and trade together in the future.
Rami, you want to take that?
Just one quick comment on Annapolis. That I think the striking thing about Annapolis is how late it came in the Bush administration. I think the 7 years of not only broad neglect of Arab-Israeli peacemaking, but a clear tilt to the Israeli side, especially with Bush's letter to Sharon and other indications. And we still see it in Annapolis. The U.S. at Annapolis, the president himself publicly committed the U.S. to track and monitor the situation and to track compliance. And we haven't heard a footnote about that from the United States. So this is what I mean to say, that the United States lacks almost total credibility in public opinion in the Arab world. People just don't take it seriously in its diplomatic engagements in this field because of its track record. I think we have to distinguish between rhetoric and reality. I think the American rhetoric is very good. In fact, everything the U.S. government says about freedom, democracy, justice, rule of law, etc., is fine. We agree with it all. But when it comes to implementation, the U.S. policies on the ground are either distorted or incomplete or biased or whimsical or militaristic or selective. And it's just the implementation of the policies leads to a situation where so many people, not just in the Middle East, this is the real, I think, tragedy of what the Bush administration's foreign policy has done for America's standing in the world. It's all over the world where there is criticism of the United States. But this criticism, as I said before, is in a context in which ordinary people all over the Middle East and the world want to be close to the U.S. They like the U.S. You know, in my whole adult life in the Middle East, I have never heard anybody say they want to live in a situation like the Iranian situation. Nobody calls for an Iranian-style government or, say, a Syrian-style or Libyan-style or that kind of government. people want to live like people live here. They want the freedom, the opportunity, the education, etc., the values that people, the respect, the human rights. They like what America offers. But massive numbers of people are critical of the U.S. and line up with Syria and Iran because that's the only way they feel they can respond to what they see as predatory, aggressive, dangerous, and threatening American policies. So we need to distinguish between the reaction to American policies and the respect and even aspiration for sharing American values. And I think that's the great tragedy, that 9/11 gave the United States an opportunity to engage these large numbers of people all over the Middle East, to bring them into a process where Americans and Middle Easterners, Arabs, Israelis, Turks, Iranians, everybody could operate according to a single standard. But the U.S. didn't do that. It chose a different approach. And I think we should also be fair. The problems of the Middle East are predominantly problems of the people of the Middle East. The United States is a major external player. It didn't create all of these problems, but it exacerbates some of them and it perpetuates some of them by its policies. So it has become a huge local structural player now in the Middle East with 180,000 troops in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. So it is no longer just a disinterested external party. It has become one of the local actors. But all of these issues, all of these criticisms that I've made are criticisms of policies that can change. None of these are irreversible. They're all reversible. And I agree with Nick, absolutely, the change in the second term of the Bush administration. I think it's very clear in terms of the Iranian situation, even in Hezbollah in Lebanon. I'm not Lebanese, I'm Palestinian, Jordanian, but I've noticed in Lebanon the U.S. seemed to have pulled back a little bit on this tremendous pressure on Hezbollah that we had in 2003, 2004, and saying basically leave it for the Lebanese to try to resolve. So I think there are signs of the U.S. coming to terms with reality, being more realistic, being more pragmatic, partly because I think the U.S. has no other choice. Its policies have essentially failed in most of these cases that I outlined. And the U.S. is a pragmatic country. It's not an ideologically driven country. So I think it comes to terms with these things. So those are positive aspects as well.
Do we allow to debate? Can I just respond? Is that okay? Very quickly?
Quickly, yes.
Predatory, aggressive, dangerous, and irresponsible. Rami, 4 words you used to describe the United States. Those are a lot of the words that Arabs use to describe Iran privately. All throughout the Middle East, there's a tremendous concern in the Arab world about Iran, and some of those words are often used. First point. Second, it can't be the case in this discussion that we're having that the United States is responsible for all the problems of the Middle East and only and solely responsible. Now, we are the major outside actor, and therefore we have to take the responsibility when things go well and when they don't. I don't think you see me shy away from that today. But is it also true that the countries of the region, the governments of the region especially, bear the greater measure of responsibility for what's happening in their own region? I would say yes. And third, and this is just an errant debating point, I'm very concerned as a former professional diplomat and as an American who cares about our standing in the world, about the high degree of anti-Americanism in the world. I recognize it. I felt it, as did my family, when we lived overseas. And it has certainly increased in the last decade or so. So I'm not blind to it. And, it's important that we Americans think about how we can recoup some of the credibility and prestige that we clearly have lost. Having said that, it is simply not true that the world is awash in a sea of anti-Americanism. It's not true in India, if you look at the public opinion polls, and it's not true in China. And those are the 2 greatest and biggest countries in the world. And with India, of course, we have an emerging democratic partnership. It's not true in Southeast Asia. It's certainly not true in Africa, as you saw when President Bush traveled there in February. He is very well thought of. And he has risen to the occasion in Africa with his $30 billion HIV/AIDS program. I'm not here as a spokesman for the Bush administration. I'm retired and I'm a private citizen. But my own professional view and my experience living in 6 countries over 25 years tells me that we have a lot to worry about in increased anti-Americanism. We need to respond to that, I hope, in an effective way. But we've also done some good things in the world. President Clinton and President Bush have shepherded this major improvement in relations with India, where Ambassador Pickering was once the United States ambassador. Our relations with China are as good today as they have been in the history of our relations with China. Not without major problems, but as good as they have been. So I think I just want to temper some of the discussion here and provide a framework for the next administration that will be perhaps more objective.
Okay. I'm going to take a question from the overflow, please. Both of you. Israel's nuclear arsenal, Iran's uranium enrichment, how do they impact each other? Nick,
is that a question for Rami or for me?
For both of you. You can even, please.
I would never compare Israel to Iran. I would never compare the Israeli government to the Iranian government. Israel is a friend of the United States. A big part of our foreign policy in the region should be to safeguard Israel from future challenges caused by Iran. And so I would not agree to any moral or political equivalence between the two governments. We're friends with with Israel. Unfortunately, we're not friends with Iran. I do think, I want to repeat, Hala, what I said before. I don't think this is a time for war. I don't think it's a time for a military solution. I know it's a time for diplomacy. And as we have not been at the table for 28, 29 years with this country, we need to find our way to the table. There's a very good proposal on the table right now for the Iranians to accept or reject. I think all the world hopes they'll accept it in the next several weeks. It's a very good proposal backed by disparate countries from all over the world, from Asia, from Europe, and from North America. I'd put the emphasis on what the Iranians need to do for peace more than what Israel or the United States needs to do.
Rami,
Just
the
quick,
view from the region, do they
quick
impact
point,
each other?
I think one of the points that needs to be taken into consideration more, and this is partly in response to Nick's comment about the U.S. standing in the world, which is that are we talking about governments or are we talking about public opinion? And I think there's a big difference there. In the Arab world, for instance, all of the Arab governments, I think, except for maybe Syria and one or two, but most of them are very afraid of Iran. They're very critical of Iran. Many governments tell the U.S., strike Iran, hit it. But public opinion is broadly supportive of Iran in the Arab world. So there's a big disconnect between public opinion and political elites and governing elites. And most of these elites that are friendly to the U.S. are chronically, structurally, collectively non-democratic, have been for 50, 60 years and seem to be ready to pass it on to their kids. So there's a problem in terms of how are we gauging public sentiments towards the U.S. I think I repeat again what I said is that clearly, and I said this, and I agree with Nick, or he agrees with me, that the U.S. is not to blame for all of these problems. But I think if we judge U.S. foreign policy in the last 6-7 years, it has aggravated most of these problems and created some new ones, combined with the incoherence and in some cases criminality of the governments of the region. I mean, clearly the Arab governments have tremendous things to answer for, but so does the Israeli government and the Iranian government, and in some cases the Turkish government. So I think there's plenty of blame to pass around. Nobody comes out of this looking very good. So I think we need to judge these things very clearly in terms of what are the criteria we're using. If public opinion matters, if the voice of the people matters in a democratic system, and if this is what the U.S. wants to promote, it would seem to me that we should listen to the voice of public opinion all around the world. And if that voice is critical of the U.S., we should somehow figure out what does that mean, why is it so. It's not that people are viscerally anti-American, it's that they're critical of certain specific policies, and I outlined my criticisms of the policies before. But again, these are all solvable issues. I think this is what we really need to do in this next 6 months, is all of us, institutions here in the Arab world, study these things together and try to come up with a series of conclusions about why is it that people in the U.S. do this, people in the Arab world, people in Iran, elsewhere, and is there a possibility to address their underlying legitimate grievances and move to a win-win situation? I think there is, and I'm sure Nick thinks there is too, and this is what we need to do. We need to address the positive factors that unite us, and that they're very strong, to build that into our diplomatic efforts.
We're taking that question. Yes.
We hear so much about Iran supplying arms throughout the Middle East, and I believe you mentioned it also. But when you look at each country, like you mentioned now, supplying arms to the Taliban, I do believe that Iran was given great credit for helping the U.S. in the rehabilitation after 9/11. And also, over the years, Iran has been really one of the biggest critics and enemies of the Taliban. In Iraq, all we hear is supplying some IEDs. Compare that to the U.S. invasion and the massive arms supplied to Sunni and other groups by the U.S. And you mentioned Hamas. All I see Hamas have is a few homemade rockets and some pea shooters compared to 1.2 billion, I believe that's the figure, supplied every year to Israel. So if you're criticizing Iran for supplying arms, what do you have to say about the U.S.?
Thank you. I'll take another question too. Yes, please, in the front. Yes, just wait for, yes. Yes, you just short questions.
Yes, very short question.
Yeah.
I would like Ambassador Burns to explain why he thinks there's this anti-American feeling in the Arab world. What is it for?
Okay. Let me read also one question from the overflow, and then maybe you can take all three questions. Assad indicated that peace between Syria and Israel is likely going to take 6 months to 2 years. What are the ramifications for Iran, Israel policies, Syria, if Israel and Syria settle their differences? All three questions, please.
Just answer that first one first.
Okay, short answer.
Yeah,
You're running out
the
of time.
Syrian-Israeli potential for peacemaking would be historic in changing. Syria is the most strategically located political actor in the whole region. It has links to Lebanon, to Hezbollah, to Iraq, Iran, Hamas, everybody in the region. And it is a tremendous influencer and logistical player in many areas, most of which the U.S. government sees as negative. People in the region have a mixed view. So an Israeli-Syrian peace agreement would have tremendous, I think, positive consequences on all aspects of the region. It would not, though, result in what the Americans and Israelis often speak of rather, I think, naively and romantically as flipping Syria, that Syria would suddenly stop its relations with Iran and drop Hezbollah and Hamas. It would certainly make adjustments, and it would not make any of those adjustments in response to Israeli and American demands. So I think there needs to be a lot more sophistication and nuance and understanding of local realities, but certainly this is a tremendously important goal, and people should be working overtime to achieve it.
Yeah. Very quickly, I would just say that in my own judgment, there is no equality between U.S. arms sales to the region and Iran's. The United States supports states and peoples who are trying to create a peaceful future for the Middle East. So our arms sales are to Israel, quite appropriately, to Egypt, to the moderate Palestinians, to Fatah, in terms of security assistance and security training, not arms per se, to the Lebanese government, and to other moderate governments in the Gulf, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Those arms sales are designed to strengthen those states and to strengthen a future where all those states can live in peace with each other. That is not true of Iran. Iran is funding agents that want to break apart the status quo in the Middle East by violence, and in many cases through terrorism. I listed before the number of terrorist groups that Iran is now arming against moderate Arabs. And so I don't see any degree of equality whatsoever between them. And in terms of anti-Americanism, I think that was a very thoughtful question. A very thoughtful question. I don't have any brilliant answers. I would just say this. I am very concerned by the fact that so many Muslims and so many Arabs perceive the United States to be the problem in the world. We're not a perfect country, and we have made a fair number of mistakes. but we're also a country that wants to help the Arab and Muslim world to succeed. It is often forgotten that President Clinton intervened twice in the Balkans on behalf of Muslim peoples against the Serb army and the Bosnian Serb army in Bosnia and Kosovo. We've kept our troops there for the better part of a decade to help the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina and now the Muslim majority population of a new independent state, Kosovo, to survive and succeed. And I do think that we will not easily win back the trust or confidence of many Muslims unless we are seen to be working with great energy and conviction on two problems: peace between Israel and the Palestinians, justice for the Palestinians as well, and peace in Iraq. And I think there you have an American government now that is working for peace in both places. You will certainly, I think, have an American government in 2009, no matter who's elected, working in the same direction. And I hope over time we can reclaim some of the mutual trust that is so important, because the Muslim world and the Arab world are vital to us. And we have a growing Muslim population in our own country that is succeeding here. And I hope that in general we can help to make up for this very sorry state of affairs where we're not communicating well with a great number of people in that region. And I do think the seeds are in place for that to happen, but probably very slowly over time.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to stop now because our speakers have prior commitment and they have to rush. I'd like to thank them both, and I'm sure we will have them again here